This is UC Davis Live. I'm Satirius Johnson. April is Autism Acceptance Month, formerly Autism Awareness Month. Since 1998, the UC Davis Mind Institute has been working to improve the lives of autistic and neurodivergent people, especially children and their families, and has seen many advances in understanding these conditions. Today, we're talking with three experts. Aubyn Stahmer is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UC Davis Health. She's a child clinical psychologist and researcher specializing in translating intervention for children with autism and other developmental disabilities to community programs. Sarah Dufek is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UC Davis Health. She's a licensed psychologist and board-certified behavior analyst with expertise in the assessment and treatment of autism across the lifespan. And Patrick Dwyer is an autistic person who is currently pursuing his Ph.D. in developmental psychology at UC Davis. He has a broad interest in helping to ensure that autistic people can lead fulfilling lives, but his research currently focuses specifically on sensory processing and attention in autism. In addition to being a researcher, Patrick facilitates a peer support group for neurodivergent students at UC Davis. Welcome to you, and thanks for coming on to the show today.
Thanks for having us.
Indeed.
As a reminder, if you're watching us live, we're taking your questions. Just leave them in the comment section and we'll work in as many as we can. So Patrick, let's start with you. What does it mean to be an autistic person?
That is a very deep question. And it actually becomes complicated when you think about it. You can't really look, somewhere in my brain or at some gene and be like, oh yes, that's the thing that makes all autistic people autistic. It doesn't work that way. It refers to behaviors and experiences, and the boundaries of that are, defined in particular ways by our society, but for good reasons. And so, my experience of autism is my experience of autism, not going to be everybody's experience of autism, but for me, for example, it means that I've tended to experience some sensory distress and overload, especially when I was younger. Just going about one's day, you're exposed to a lot of sensory stimuli that can actually be really distressing and really make it very difficult to function and cope. So that was a very negative aspect of my autism, again, especially when I was younger. But then there's also other aspects, like, for example, I have, very intense focus on, particular things that are interesting to me, including autism research itself. And, another aspect of my autism is that, I'm pretty comfortable in certain routines, and I don't necessarily feel any particular desire to go out and change those and do new things. And these are just, pervasive things that sort of make me who I am. But somebody else who's autistic is going to have very different experiences. So, for example, you might see somebody for whom some of those things I just mentioned might be less salient, or maybe something else is more salient, like maybe somebody who is really struggling a lot socially to fit in with other people, and who feels an intense pressure to fit in and conform to sort of neurotypical expectations of how social communication works. A lot of autistic women and girls face particular pressure in that area, and this pressure to hide who they are, to mask or camouflage. Or maybe there might be other people where it's a completely different experience, where really it's the motor challenges that make it difficult to sort of go about your daily life and, function and communicate with other people. Forming mouth words, can be very difficult for people with those motor challenges. And then to make things more complicated, like I said, the way we define and cut up the boundaries, it's a little made up. And so, there's things like intellectual disabilities and ADHD and all these other things that, can overlap and fit into that picture. So how autism is experienced, it's going to vary so much from person to person, but there are ways that, in which setting up this category of autism have made sense, refers to very real experiences and behaviors. And from my perspective as an autistic advocate, one important reason why having this category of autism is important is that it gives us a way of meeting other neurodivergent people, meeting people with whom we might have things in common, who might have similar experiences to us. You mentioned before, I facilitate a community of neurodivergent students here at UC Davis for exactly that reason.
Right.
There's also, the advantage in terms of, political advocacy, getting supports and accommodations and services that we want, opposing discrimination and oppression, which are unfortunately serious issues, and just having a positive identity. We face challenges and are disabled, but we can, be proud of our autism, be proud of who we are.
Right.
So those are motivations that are quite different from medical view, though.
Right. And so when we talk about someone being on the spectrum, that is referring to this wide variety of variables and experiences that people have, right?
Yes. In fact, some people have actually started to speak of a constellation. So there's autistic advocates in the UK, like Caroline Hurst and others who have started using this term constellation to emphasize that it's variable on many dimensions. A spectrum, you might imagine that is like, oh, we can line up every person in the world and rank them on a scale of most autistic to least autistic. And it doesn't work that way. It's, multiple dimensions, any aspect of variability and diversity and intersectionality that you would find in humans anywhere, you can find in autism. Probably somewhat amplified, somewhat even more variable.
Mm-hmm. So Aubyn, from the medical point of view, what is autism? How is it identified?
Yes, also a challenging question, right? So like Patrick was saying, there's not a blood test or a genetic test that we can do for autism. So we're looking for a constellation of behavioral characteristics. There's not one thing that's going to say this person has autism or this person doesn't. So we're looking for social communication differences, and that is the broad range of social communication. So it could be an individual isn't speaking verbally, but they're also not making up for that with gestures and things, and using communication in a way that gets their point across to other people in a way that easily makes sense to other people. It could be that someone has a lot of language and it is at what we would expect for their age group, but they're using it differently in social situations, right? And so there's a full range there. And then the other thing besides social communication that we're looking for are these what might be considered repetitive behaviors, that extra focus Patrick was talking about, and sensory challenges with sounds or textures, differences in sleep that may come from that. It might look like someone has repetitive behaviors, or a child is playing with toys differently than we would expect, looking at them, taking them apart rather than playing garage or something like that. Mm-hmm. That social communication area and then the repetitive behavior area are the two things we're looking for. And there are, multiple things within that. That combination of all those things together is what we call autism.
Mm-hmm. And how has the pandemic affected autism diagnoses or services and autistic individuals, especially in terms of maybe loss of services and support?
Yeah, so especially for little children, right? Oftentimes the way you get referred to be identified as autistic is you go into your physician and the parents say, oh, my child's not talking or playing differently, and they get referred for an autism evaluation. And kids have not been going into the doctor as much during the pandemic because we all have not been going into the doctor as much. And so that has limited the number of referrals. We've also had challenges early in the pandemic not doing anything in person or doing things with masks on, which makes social communication a challenge for everyone. And that's made it very difficult. And so researchers here and at Vanderbilt and other places have been working really hard at methods for identification and intervention. Certainly kids with all kinds of developmental disabilities, and especially those who have intersectionality with socioeconomic challenges and racial ethnic challenges, have really lost the school services, not been able to do online school as well, and lots of in-home services that we haven't been able to provide as people can't be in person.
Mm-hmm. Has that changed at all now that things have become, some of these restrictions are easing up?
Yeah, people are just in some places just starting right now to go back and doing in-person services. Schools have been in for a while in many places, and I think masking restrictions lifting will be very helpful both for identifying and for providing services. And I think for some people, and maybe Patrick wants to speak to this, maybe Zoom has been more helpful, and people have had lower social kind of demands on them, but also it limits the services that you might be able to get.
Yeah, among sort of the autistic adult community, there's a really strong preference, I would say, in favor of some flexibility and hybrid options, just recognizing that, everybody has different needs, is in a different sort of position. And so there's some autistic people who are really going to prefer that flexibility to just stay at home and communicate over Zoom. And then there's other people who are really going to struggle with that and want things to be in person, and having that flexibility is really important and just good universal design.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, Sarah, have we gotten better at identifying autism in children? Are there new tools available compared to years ago?
Well, I'd say we've gotten better at some things, but we're still struggling in other areas. So I think as a group, diagnosticians we've gotten a lot better identifying children earlier, I would say, catching the need for an evaluation earlier in the manner that Aubyn described at the pediatric office, and then getting kids in sooner and younger and looking for those early red flags and catching kids earlier. But we're still struggling with areas that we were hoped would be better by now, like catching kids from historically underrepresented groups, non-white children, children who have this other intersecting conditions that may impact their ability for us to see the autism, let's say. We've noticed we have a particular need for catching women on the spectrum as well. So all of our tools and techniques we have for identifying autism as a diagnostician, since it's behaviorally based, right? So we can't do a blood test. We have to do it based on our behavioral interactions and families reporting symptoms to us, is really validated on mostly boys and men. So we have a lot of ways to go in terms of figuring out what autism looks like in girls, especially young girls. And so we're really trying to do a lot of work there to identify those barriers and get to it.
What are some of the challenges? What are those barriers?
Well, it seems like the way we conceptualize things, like the most common one discussed is, as a group, when you're in training to be a diagnostician and identify what autism is and with someone in front of you, you get sort of a representation by your experience and what people tell you about what certain symptoms may look like, for example, or certain characteristics may look like. So as Aubyn mentioned, one thing we're always looking for is what we call restricted repetitive behavior, or stereotype behavior. And we have different character that could be a myriad of different ways that can play out. And all of our examples oftentimes have been created for us, or we've learned them from interacting with boys or men. So we don't have an idea necessarily of what those behaviors will look like in girls. And so we have an idea as diagnosticians of that's what we're looking for. And what we're finding is sometimes girls, that those behaviors are represented in a different way, often a more socially acceptable way. And they, being obsessed with all the different Disney princesses and wanting them to be represented in their play a certain way. And we tend to accept that. It seems like the diagnosticians tend to accept that, like, oh, well, lots of girls do that, and that's not necessarily counted here. But it's just a small example of how those things can kind of add up, where we just don't have enough experience in how those characteristics play out in girls. And we need more information and more research on that.
Right.
If I could jump in for just a second,
Sure.
It's not even just the diagnosticians, but often it's the referral. It's the people out in the community who are the first points of contact, the doctors, the teachers, who just don't even think of autism and don't bother to refer the person to the diagnostician who could be able to provide that diagnosis.
It's a very good point, Patrick. And that also impacts, like how I mentioned, folks who are from historically underrepresented groups often are referred for different things, not autism, because the referral person is not necessarily thinking of autism for those groups right away. And so they end up on a different track sometimes, when in reality, it would be great if they could get to a specialist who's looking for autism symptoms. So you're right, Patrick, a lot of times that bottleneck starts at that point, which is unfortunate because they're not even getting to the diagnostician properly.
Right. So it's a combination of knowing what the different presentations or whatever symptoms are, and then also training people who are dealing with children, like teachers and diagnosticians, to know them.
Yes, and I think we're actively doing research and trying to get better at it. But as with most things, implementation is a challenge, where it's like, even once we have information about what the challenge is, it's hard to then change, get that information out and start changing folks' daily practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Aubyn, how important is it to identify autistic children early?
Yeah, we think it's pretty important if we can get in and identify early, because kids are often frustrated if they can't communicate their needs because they're communicating differently than we're expecting, or parents are interacting the way you would with a child who doesn't have sensory differences or communication differences. And that can be frustrating. It can be traumatic. It can be a lot of things just because parents don't know. So the earlier that we can know that this child is learning differently and interacting with the world differently, we can start adjusting things to provide the support that they need to learn from their environment, to have an environment that supports them rather than an environment that is going to be more challenging. So we think that's important, and brains are developing young, and so we can also help kids learn to communicate using language. If we start earlier, we're more likely to see that, and that can be helpful in the general environment later as well.
Mm-hmm. Again, if you're watching us live, we are taking your questions. Just leave them in the comments section and we'll work in as many as we can. So what sorts of interventions are available now?
Sarah, do you want to start, or do you want me to?
Sure. Well, we have lots of different interventions usually available depending on your geographic location and the age of the individual who has autism. So that's a really highly variable question, depending on where you are and who you are and what kind of needs you have. I think, and I think Patrick and Aubyn sort of alluded to this already, is we're tending to think of intervention in a different way now. We used to think of it more in terms of like, oh, we have to intervene with the individual with autism so that they can change and accommodate to their environment. But we're really finding more that a more measured approach, like adjusting the environment to adjust to the person, is really helpful, which is why early identification is also important, because many autistic adults would say that they felt very different from the beginning, and it was nice to have some context for that so that they could, and then also meet other people like them. So ideally, when we talk about intervention, we're really creating a situation that works on both sides. So the individual with autism can be comfortable and feel included and heard, and that society also can change and benefit from all the wonderful things that autistic folks bring to society. So, but I think many times when we're thinking of intervention nowadays, we're thinking of it in terms of, what's challenging for the individual and their family, and how can we take what we know from what works from research and say, okay, so, your child's frustrated because they can't communicate. Here's the toolbox of things that we know work to increase communication. That could be verbal language or augmentative communication systems. Here's what we have. Let's see what's the right match for your child, usually, because we try to start intervention early, and what works for your family. And let's try to apply that. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, let's do something else. Let's try something else. So there are many interventions. Autism affects quite multiple systems, like in domains of development. So you'll find that we have many different interventions, from speech to occupational therapy to the field of behavior analysis. And so those ideally are assigned in a very individualized way to the person and their needs and their family's needs to make it work, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I
if
think
I could,
go ahead, Patrick.
Okay, I'll say my thing quickly, which is just a plug for some of my collaborators who, further to what Sarah and Aubyn were saying about early identification, actually telling somebody they're autistic at a younger age, we found is associated with better quality of life. It gives people, exactly as Sarah was saying, some time to adjust their identity, and then they're not wondering, why am I different? Why am I struggling with all these things for their whole life? So that's Bella Kaufner and Kristen Gillespie Lynch and Thompson or Aviv. I probably garbled those names, which is really embarrassing since they're great collaborators of mine, but they've recently published that paper.
And I think historically our interventions have been very structured, and like Sarah was saying, really trying to cure autism. And now we've learned from people who are autistic that that's not our goal, that our goal is support. And we're talking about that here like that's a universal thing people can access, and it isn't. It's a slow shift in the community. And so I think it's going to take autistic people and their parents, as kids are younger, really thinking about how we're going to increase our family and our child and this individual's quality of life in the context of having autism or being autistic, rather than how are we going to fix this person who's an amazing person, and we just have to figure out how to make the world work.
Are there any, national efforts to kind of educate teachers, educate security people at schools to, be more informed about, say a student who may appear to be having a behavioral problem, but it's actually something else?
I think there are many efforts to do that, and like all efforts, it's challenging, right? Because you want to educate the other kids, you want to educate law enforcement, and you want to educate educators. And so I think that there are efforts to make that happen, and it's just going to take time and people's willingness to be open to lots of differences, in autism being one of them.
So, April used to be called Autism Awareness Month, but there's now a shift to autism acceptance. Why is that? And what's the significance of the shift? Patrick, let's start with you.
Sorry, was having some trouble with my mute button there.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really great question. And, it speaks to what we've been saying about how we've been learning about things. So, back in the day, we were talking about autism awareness, and a lot of autistic advocates really strenuously objected to that, saying like, whoa, that is not enough. You can be aware of autism and you can still discriminate against autistic people. You can still think about autism in really derogatory ways. That it's not what we actually need, that what we need is to be accepted for who we are, while still having access to the accommodations and supports that we need in order to be included in neurotypical society. And that is why we shifted from awareness to acceptance.
Mm-hmm. Aubyn?
I mean, I think Patrick said it beautifully, in that it's a big shift for a lot of the community, and really for a long time, awareness was necessary to get people to know. When I started in this field a very long time ago, and people would say, "What do you do?" Well, I work with autistic children. Oh, artistic, do they paint? People didn't know what autism was. And now people know what autism is. And like Patrick said, now it's a matter of moving on to the next step, and creating a space for autistic people.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that, we can't keep working on building awareness. Of course, as we've been saying, there's still a lot of gaps out there, especially for, multiply marginalized communities, but we can, awareness and acceptance aren't mutually exclusive.
Right. I feel like in the past, I don't know, maybe decade or so, the portrayal of autistic people has really grown a lot in the media. I'm thinking of like The Big Bang Theory with their Sheldon Cooper character. There was the series Atypical on Netflix. I mean, how do you feel about some of the portrayals that you're seeing in the media?
That's a really interesting question. I see a lot of different thoughts about this. I mean, one thing that people have been pointing out is that, some of these portrayals, like I might pick on The Big Bang Theory a little, some of them, the autism is kind of a target for humor, and in a way that's kind of derogatory and stigmatizing. And, that has reflected, a traditional sort of perspective on things. And as we've been saying, there's this shift now towards different narratives. So there's a big push underway to see more autistic actors playing autistic roles. And I think, of course, there's no reason we should limit that to autistic actors. I also like to see autistic people much more involved in writing and directing things about autism. And I think we are heading in that direction. And there's definitely a strong push for that from the community. There's also sort of a perennial issue, getting back to that. Autism is a huge, big constellation thing of, well, which part of that constellation are we representing, and, wanting to make sure that we are addressing that full diversity, that we aren't just focusing on really privileged folks, and that we aren't alternatively focusing on people who only experience some of the most severe challenges. and that we're representing all of the diversity that is out there, and also, intersectionality and multiply marginalized people, that, we're not just talking about, your white male autistics, but, your Black female autistics and all the other kinds of autistics that we have in the world.
Chris from Facebook asks, historically and over the past 30 years or so, why was there such a shift from the previously used rigid definition of what is neurotypical? And how does a spectrum approach, or a constellation approach, I guess, affect patient diagnosis for those who land on the gray or fringe areas of the spectrum?
Since I'm old and been doing this for 30 years, you want me to start?
Yeah.
I mean, our definitions have definitely changed. And when I started in the field, we were really recognizing autism most often in people who had the most severe symptoms, and often with intellectual disability or very severe speech and language delay. And so the broadening of our definitions and of our seeing this as a spectrum really has allowed us to identify challenges in people that weren't identified before, that may have been marginalized because of their behavior, but without, like Patrick was saying, an understanding of why this was happening. So I think we've gotten better at understanding this is a spectrum. And, when we changed the definitions from having these categorical to it being a spectrum, it was really because data were showing that people weren't very good at pigeonholing individuals into these particular categories that we had made up for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which we use for diagnosis. And so having it be a spectrum, we were better able to accurately say this person has autism, rather than inaccurately give them one of these other names that oftentimes were, if you didn't have the right name, you weren't able to access services, even though your needs might have been the same as someone with a different category. I don't know, Sarah, if you have other.
I actually have a bit of a secret here about my own diagnosis. I actually got diagnosed back in the day with high functioning autism, when I probably really met criteria for Asperger's. And that was because at that time, where I lived at that time growing up, the category of high functioning autism led to better services. So they kind of cheated there.
This is the exact reason why they've switched to this more inclusive diagnostic criteria, because we realized we were missing a lot of folks that really could benefit from access to support and services. And there's also the phenomenon of the broader autism phenotype, which I think Chris was asking about too in that question, about folks who may not meet current diagnostic criteria completely, but seem to have showing some characteristics of autism that that they identify with, and that it just may not add up to an autism diagnosis, but they can still definitely identify with, characteristics of autism itself. And I think that just speaks to what we're really conceptualizing now as the neurodiversity aspect of it, that this is normal variation in the way our brain is developed as a human being, and we should look at it as such, I think.
Now, Patrick, you identify yourself as autistic rather than a person with autism. Why is that important?
Yeah, so this is something that's been pointed out by a lot of advocates, autistic advocates like Jim Sinclair, deaf advocates, who have been listening to people talking about what we call person-first language, which has been sort of the recommended way to talk about disabilities from the eyes of a lot of professional organizations, researchers, and things like that. And person-first language, that's where you go and say, here is a person with a disability, a person with autism. You put the person before the disability. You sort of try and separate the person from the disability, in fact, because you want to recognize the personhood and not be confused by a disability. And from the perspective of autistic advocates like myself, this is actually really condescending, because what is so wrong with being autistic or disabled that we feel the need to separate it off that way? We don't go around saying things like, oh, you are a person of Chinese Canadian descent who is a woman, but I don't want to call you a Chinese Canadian woman because, I want to recognize you're a person first before your femaleness or your Chinese Canadian ancestry. that is really, when you think about it, a pretty offensive thing to say. So there's definitely a push from a lot of advocates saying, this actually probably reflects some stigma that we need to address. Why don't we just say we're autistic and be proud of that?
Is that something that has kind of, become the norm or mainstream, or is there really still some kind of tension in the community?
It's still, very much a point of tension, and not all of the different disability communities agree either. So, for example, I will say person with an intellectual disability, because most people with intellectual disabilities that I know still prefer a person first language and think of it as less stigmatizing and better respecting their identities. So, of course, it's not my job to determine how they should identify. It's my job to listen to what they're saying and respect that. So that's, there's still issues there that need to be worked out. And unfortunately, I think there's still some rigid thinking as well. We always say that autistic people show rigid and inflexible thinking, and perhaps that's true in certain ways, but perhaps it's also true in certain ways that our societies can be very rigid and inflexible. And so once you get organizations locked into a particular habit of using terminology a certain way, it can often be difficult to change that. So unfortunately, it's kind of a flashpoint right now. And in some ways, as soon as you open your mouth and start picking one version of the terminology or another, you're sort of taking sides. So hopefully some of the divisive politics will change there, and people will move towards just respecting people's identities as they are.
Right. So, before we go, I was hoping to hear from each of you about how things have changed for autistic people over the last few years and what changes you hope to see. Sarah, let's start with you.
I think we've changed quite a bit in the last 15 to 20 years, for sure. I know during my time, as Aubyn said, I had the same experience. Folks would say, how artistic are they? And I would say, oh, yeah, autistic people can be artistic, but that's not what I meant. And I would have to, but I think the biggest change I've seen is that, yes, more people I know someone with autism. They know they actually have an autistic person in their family or their. So I think that awareness piece that we first started on is definitely happening. I'm noticing with professionals, they're really thinking about autism more with their families that they're seeing even early on. In terms of what I hope to see, I think the neurodiversity movement has been fantastic, and I hope that it keeps keeping its momentum and aggressively going ahead, and that we as professionals can find ways to constructively support it. I think sometimes it's hard for professionals to know how to get involved in an advocacy way to help. So I guess that's what I would say would be my priority.
Aubyn?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've seen so much change. When I got into this field, we were blaming mothers for causing autism in their kids, and we aren't doing that anymore. And this is good news. And families are a really important part of development and part of intervention and supporting individuals who are autistic. And I also think we're getting better at, because of the neurodiversity movement, really being respectful of characteristics that are part of who kids are and who adults are, and not trying to make them normal per se, or make people be who they aren't, like we wouldn't for anyone else. And I think that's been a huge shift as well. So as it becomes less stigmatizing in many communities, I think that becomes important in terms of inclusion and just being more accepting. And I hope that where we go is getting better at things that are universally designed so all people can learn from them, whether they're using alternative communication, whether they have intellectual disability, whether they have sensory challenges, whatever the need, that we as a society get better at being more inclusive and being more aware that people need different supports, but everyone has important information and things to offer us.
Patrick?
I really agree with everything that Sarah and Aubyn are saying, and when it was just really a year or two before I was born that the Autism Network International was founded, which was the very first time that like 3 autistic people got together under their own power, not because, you know, some parent was sending them into a therapy space and decided they wanted to do political advocacy. So really this neurodiversity movement, you know, has come together in my, you know, fairly short so far lifetime. And there's been tremendous progress that's been made there. As was said, still a long ways to go. You know, there's still wide gaps, unfortunately, on a lot of issues where people in the community are just really not trustful of professionals and researchers and even parents, and a lot of, you know, unresolved, you know, disputes. And you know, I really am hoping that we will move more towards reconciliation, towards, you know, finding common ground on these issues, and, you know, recognizing the insights that the neurodiversity movement has that are valuable, and the common ground that we all have. And then, you know, maybe we can get to a point where instead of spending all of our time fighting each other within the autism world, we'll be able to focus on, you know, achieving the sorts of larger scale change that will benefit our whole community.
Well, you know, this has been really a fascinating conversation. I want to thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Aubyn Stahmer. Aubyn Stahmer is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UC Davis Health. Sarah Dufek is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UC Davis Health. And Patrick Dwyer is an autistic person who is currently pursuing his Ph.D. in developmental psychology at UC Davis. I'm Satirius Johnson. Until next time, this is UC Davis Live.